Opening the center grants swift access for your queen and king's bishop to the battlefield. Pioneering the Caro Kann defense. Black fortifies the d5 square and prepares for a solid pawn structure. Aiming for queenside development. Asserting central space dominance with this pawn thrust prepares for a powerful queenside expansion. Provokes a central confrontation, immediately challenging white's ambitious pawn formation for equality. Opening the center with this capture invites dynamic play, potentially sacrificing pawn structure for active piece development. Recapturing here grants black a freer center and opens diagonals for piece development. A welcome change after the pawn exchange. Recapturing here concedes a central pawn majority, potentially weakening the queenside structure later. Developing the knight to a central square immediately challenges the pawn and prepares to recapture. Material. A sensible reaction to the central pawn exchange. Developing a knight to its natural outpost solidifies central control and prepares for castling. Reclaiming the pawn with knight secures central presence but invites white's pieces to develop aggressively toward the king. Securing the knight's central presence while preparing for a kingside pawn advance is the immediate goal, aiming to develop piece activity harmoniously and create future attacking possibilities. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to develop the bishop unlocks dynamic possibilities, though it concedes some initial tempo. Developing the bishop here sets a clear intention to control the dark squares and potentially target the kingside if black doesn't react carefully, creating an immediate tension that demands black's attention. Developing the bishop to its natural square prepares castling and bolsters the center, creating a solid foundation for future queenside expansion. Solidifying the king's safety opens up avenues for piece development. This castling maneuver, tucked away from the center's impending storm, prepares a counter-thrust. Securing the monarch amidst this dynamic pawn structure instantly fosters a more harmonious development and prepares for potential central action. Slinging the rook to the central file promises an immediate claim over open lines, potentially pinning that knight or creating threats against the black king's shelter once the center clarifies. It's a dynamic repositioning that amplifies the pressure. Sacrificing material for initiative. Black disrupts white's pawn structure, aiming to open lines for their pieces while white's king remains somewhat exposed in the center. This exchange creates immediate complications and forces white to carefully assess the trade-off between material and positional advantages, potentially leading to a more dynamic middle game. Opening the d-file with this capture immediately sets up a confrontation, offering white a chance to exploit black's slightly awkward pawn structure after the exchange. Observe how the bishop on c4 and knight on f3 are now poised to influence the center more actively. Reclaiming the pawn on c3 is the immediate priority, but placing the knight on d7, while seemingly passive, subtly prepares a later central challenge. Observe how this knight, once a defender of e5, now pivots to support the e6 pawn and potentially eye the weakened c5 square if white overextends. This regrouping showcases a patient approach, prioritizing defensive solidity before counterplay. Unlocking the d-file's potential by challenging black's central pawn structure with the queen signals a bold bid for queenside initiative. Black's queen elegantly sidesteps the discovered attack and prepares to reinforce the central d5 pawn, creating a potential pawn battery along the c-file with the rook, while simultaneously eyeing the e4 square and any potential weaknesses that might emerge on white's kingside. A strategic consolidation. The bishop maneuvers to a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside and potentially supporting a future kingside pawn storm or a central expansion. This repositioning aims to improve piece coordination, putting pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn breaks. It's a quiet, yet potent, move that enhances white's central influence and offers flexibility for future plans. The bishop now contributes to controlling key squares, contributing to white's long-term positional goals. Shifting the rook to the d-file signals an immediate bid for greater influence on that central open column, preparing to challenge white's queen and potentially doubling rooks if the opportunity arises. Sharpening the diagonal pressure on the queen and preparing for a potential kingside assault by repositioning the bishop to a more active square, adding a defensive layer against any sneaky knight incursions. Rerouting the knight to f8 initiates a patient regrouping, aiming to support potential pawn breaks or improve the knight's placement on a more active square, possibly g6, to contest the light squares. The queen's repositioning towards the kingside aims to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's castled monarch, perhaps eyeing a future attack on f7 or preparing a switch to the h-file if an opportunity arises. Bringing the knight to g6 introduces a curious piece of prophylaxis, anticipating the queen's potential harassment on f5 or h5, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy the steed towards the kingside or even reinforce the central pawn structure. This repositioning skillfully avoids the immediate tactical skirmishes and focuses on a slow positional buildup, subtly influencing the nascent dark-squared bishop's diagonal. Aggressively seizing the initiative, white's queen boldly ventures into the kingside, directly challenging black's castled position and hinting at a potential mating attack or a decisive material gain by targeting the f7 square. Securing the bishop on its diagonal, this retreat stabilizes black's queenside pawn structure and prepares for eventual kingside play. While white's queen, now somewhat exposed on g4, may find itself the target of future attacks. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, white signals an aggressive intent, aiming to pry open lines and expose black's monarch before it can find adequate shelter amidst its own pieces. A bold challenge erupts in the center as black boldly advances the e-pawn, immediately contesting white's central space and creating a dynamic pawn structure that could lead to sharp exchanges. A bold assertion of central control. This queen redeployment immediately casts an eye toward the kingside, creating immediate pressure on the f7 square. Black's pawn thrust to f6 solidifies the kingside defensively, aiming to prevent white's queen from further incursions and creating a potential shelter for the king should it be forced to retreat from the center. This move, while reinforcing its own structure, also potentially hinders the development of the g7 bishop, creating a pawn chain that might become a target later on. It's a proactive step to address the immediate spatial pressure from white's active pieces, particularly the aggressive queen on h5. Sacrificing the bishop opens a diagonal for the queen and creates attacking potential towards black's king. But it also concedes valuable central control and weakens white's pawn structure significantly, creating long-term positional liabilities that must be carefully managed. Opening up the h-file for your king exposes it to significant danger. But reclaiming the knight and forcing a pawn structure shift offers some compensation. Black's king is now exposed to a dangerous battery forming on the g-file, and white's queen lurks menacingly. Black bravely confronts the exposed king with queenly aggression, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate the queen in the process, potentially targeting the weak squares around the monarch. A daring counterattack on the queenside now aims to exploit the open c-file, shifting the battle's focus and forcing black to confront an immediate dilemma rather than consolidating their central pawn structure. The bishop retreats, seeking a safer vantage point after its previous active placement was rendered untenable by white's persistent pawn push and subsequent queen maneuver. Reclaiming the central light squares after black's pawn push and the subsequent exchange presents white with a chance to reorient their queen. The goal is to find a more active post, potentially supporting a kingside initiative or offering defensive coverage if needed. Reinforcing the queenside and preparing to contest the open d-file by bringing the rook into play. Securing the central dark squares and preparing for potential knight maneuvers. This repositioning allows the knight to escape the cramped position and eye the queenside advance. Initiating a decisive exchange of queens on d3 offers a dynamic shift, immediately presenting a tactical crossroads for white. Black bravely decides to open up lines towards white's king, banking on the potential for queenside pressure and an active piece play, even at the cost of sacrificing queens and potentially simplifying into a slightly worse pawn structure. This bold maneuver forces white to consider the long-term repercussions of relinquishing queenly influence. A bold repositioning of the queen, aiming to redeploy to a more active square and potentially threaten the weakened kingside, while also freeing the bishop on d3 to exert influence on the central diagonals. A calculated retreat to safeguard the bishop and establish a more robust defensive structure, aiming to consolidate the queenside and prepare for potential counterplay against white's centralized king. A sudden royal hunt begins as the white queen escorts the opposing king to a more exposed position. This aggressive check forces black to immediately address the safety of their monarch, disrupting any nascent plans for piece development or positional consolidation. Notice how the queen's advance, while tactically forcing, also leaves her somewhat isolated from her own army. White will need to be mindful of potential counterplay if black can capitalize on this momentary disorganization. The position hinges on whether black can effectively defend their king and exploit the queen's forward placement, or if white can leverage the forced movement to launch a decisive attack. Sacrificing the queen might seem drastic, but black is aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and create counterplay on the queenside, exploiting the now open c-file and the weakened b2 pawn. This forces white to commit their pieces to defending the king, potentially opening avenues for black's rooks to become active and exploit the doubled pawns. The exchange also simplifies the position, which can be beneficial for the side with less space, as black will attempt to achieve once white's queen is out of the picture. Opening the knight's path to the center now reclaims a crucial central square for white, aiming to exploit the lingering weaknesses around black's king and potentially activate the rook on the c-file, stabilizing the position after the queen exchange. Black repositions the bishop to the now open c-file, aiming to activate it and potentially contest white's central pawn majority, probing the queenside with an advance. This establishes a potential outpost for the knight should it find its way to b6, while simultaneously restricting black's queenside expansion and aiming to create weaknesses along the now open queenside files, initiating the king's relocation to a safer square. This maneuver begins a slow but deliberate repositioning of the monarch, preparing for potential skirmishes on the central files and aiming to shield itself from the ongoing queenside pressure. This move opens up the f-file, a potentially decisive factor in the subsequent play, while simultaneously bolstering the central pawn structure and offering more dynamic possibilities for white's pieces to participate in the fight for space. The rook's journey to the open 8th rank solidifies control of that vital pathway, anticipating potential skirmishes and offering escape routes for the king should the center collapse further, unlocking the kingside pawn structure. 28. Fxe5** immediately targets the central squares and aims to disrupt black's comfortable positioning, creating potential weaknesses that can be exploited later. The rook's desperate lunge to the fourth rank injects immediate, raw energy into the position, aiming to leverage open files that white has carefully constructed. While this maneuver potentially activates a powerful long-range piece, it simultaneously exposes the king's sanctuary on g7 to a potentially more direct assault now that the defending knight is gone and the d-pawn has been sacrificed. The ensuing exchanges, should they occur, will drastically alter the material balance and open up new avenues of attack and defense for both sides. This is a moment where initiative is paramount, and black's bold gambit might just ignite a firestorm. The bishop repositions, seeking a more active diagonal and potentially preparing to support a pawn push or target weaknesses on the queenside. The rooks are lining up for a confrontation on the open column. While your king might seem safe, the pawn chain structure has been fractured, potentially leaving lingering weaknesses for white to exploit in the long run, particularly if the queens are exchanged as they appear to be heading towards. Focus on reinforcing your king's position and developing a coordinated defense. The initiative has been somewhat ceded, so solidifying your position is paramount. A strategic redirection emerges, shifting the focus to the open file and the potential for infiltrating white's position. The rook's aggressive advance to the second rank aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create an outpost, but it leaves the king somewhat exposed on the queenside. Recapturing the pawn opens up the e-file for your rook, but beware of black's potential for rapid pawn advancement on the queenside while your king remains somewhat exposed. The king ventures out from its protective shell, seeking active participation but potentially exposing itself to unexpected threats along the newly opened central files. Unlocking the c-file with this pawn capture creates immediate pressure on black's weakened queenside, forcing a stark re-evaluation of defensive priorities. The pawn structure has become irrevocably shattered around black's king, creating a network of weaknesses that white's pieces can now exploit, making for a very open and dangerous board. Exploiting the open a-file now creates immediate queenside pressure and forces black to commit to defending the advancing pawn, potentially weakening their pawn structure further. Black's creation of a protected passed pawn on b5, while seemingly a step forward, unravels the defensive structure around their king. This initiative might prove illusory as the queens are gone, and the pawn's advance has weakened the adjacent dark squares, potentially inviting a dangerous infiltration for white's knight or bishop down the now open diagonals. Asserting dominion over the open file opens a critical path for the rook's penetration towards the enemy king. The bishop's advance on the long diagonal, while seemingly proactive, relinquishes control of crucial central squares and allows white's knight to establish a strong outpost on e3. Black's intention to create a queenside pawn majority is commendable, but this maneuver opens a dangerous path for white's rook on the a-file, potentially leading to a swift invasion. The immediate consequence is a passive position for black's pieces, struggling to coordinate effectively against white's growing initiative. Unlocking the f-file for immediate counterplay, white aims to disrupt black's cozy setup and potentially force open lines around the exposed king. The rook's relocation to the fifth rank significantly amplifies pressure along the open file, menacing the uncastled monarch and potentially setting up a devastating discovery if white mismanages their pieces, initiating a decisive skirmish by forking the king. This maneuver immediately targets the exposed black monarch and its connected rook, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially win material or force a favorable exchange. Recognizing the immediate tactical danger to the king, the defender hastens to centralize his monarch, seeking refuge from the open lines and potential discovered attacks that white's aggressive pawn push on the queenside has created. Consolidating the king's position behind the pawn shield provides essential security amidst the unfolding tactical skirmishes, preparing for potential pawn advances or regrouping maneuvers as the game enters a more dynamic phase. Unveiling the bishop from its passive perch behind the pawn chain now allows it to participate in the nascent kingside attack, aiming to bolster the beleaguered monarch and potentially offer an escape square along the c7-h2 diagonal should the situation necessitate a swift repositioning from the ongoing skirmish. Reasserting control over the central files. This maneuver aims to pressure black's somewhat disorganized pieces and prevent any sneaky infiltration. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened pawn structure on the kingside and preparing to participate in the battle for the central squares, opening a path for the rook to potentially harass the black king down the g-file. But it's a tactical gamble that might overextend, challenging white's central control. This pawn push aims to pry open lines on the kingside and disrupt the opponent's coordination, potentially creating weaknesses around the black king if white isn't careful with their pawn structure. Relocating the rook to the third rank prepares to pressure the black king's defenses, potentially creating mating nets or forcing concessions with targeted attacks. Embracing the chaos on the kingside, black's monarch ventures deeper into the fray, aiming to leverage the open files and tangled lines for its own survival and perhaps to join the offensive. Activating the knight to a more central outpost, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and pressure the vulnerable f6 square. Black desperately tries to activate the rook and create some offensive pressure down the open file, hoping to distract white from their crushing kingside attack. The rook sacrifices its life, a final desperate attempt to disrupt black's burgeoning control of the open file, hoping to create complications or perhaps a swindle in this lost position. The rook's final journey brings it to the king's doorstep, aiming to disrupt any attempt at king's safety and exploit the open files now that white's rook has departed. Cutting off the black king's escape path with the knight's advance is a sharp tactical strike, aiming to capitalize on the exposed monarch and the open lines that have developed. Sacrificing the bishop to expose the white king and potentially create mating threats after. Simplifying the material. Finally, consolidating the bishop's advantage on the weakened kingside, a decisive step towards exploiting the exposed black monarch. The rook's daring sortie to the first rank, while seemingly aggressive, allows white's king to consolidate its position and begin supporting the pawn push, potentially unraveling black's central control. Securing the queenside pawn structure. b4 aims to prevent black's a pawn from advancing further and to create a more solid base for white's pieces, potentially setting up a future queenside expansion or simply solidifying white's advantage in space. The rook's discovery play is a desperate attempt to salvage something from a lost position, leveraging the temporarily exposed white king for a check. King's safety finally becomes the paramount concern, bringing the monarch to a more central, albeit still somewhat exposed, position to support potential counterplay and avoid immediate checks. Reactivating the bishop's influence on the queenside. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's passed pawn and create counterplay through the central files. Unleashing the rook with check to disrupt the enemy king's precarious safety. This aggressive push forces a crucial decision and potentially opens lines for further infiltration. Relocating the king offers a safer haven, pulling it away from the central files and potential attacks from white's rooks, while also preparing to support the passed pawn's advance. Activating the bishop to support the rook's advance aims to exploit the open diagonal, potentially creating a pawn majority threat or launching a direct attack on the weakened black king side. Activating the bishop to g2, aiming to disrupt white's rook on e1 and potentially fork the king and pawn on g3, presents a dynamic counterplay. King hunt intensified as the rook swoops in to spearhead the assault on the exposed monarch. The king's perilous journey across the board, from the perceived safety of its castled position to the exposed squares it now occupies, highlights the dire consequences of neglecting defensive preparation in favor of active piece play. Dislodging the bishop from its defensive post on e4 is crucial for the rook's mobility, opening a path for it to join the attack on the king side. Venturing the monarch deeper into enemy territory like this, while seemingly active, exposes him to significant risks as the opposing pieces align. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential becomes the primary objective as the rook shifts to patrol the 7th rank, creating pressure on the vulnerable black king. The black king, now exposed after a series of exchanges, attempts a desperate sideways shuffle, seeking any semblance of safety on the king side where white's rooks still loom ominously. Suddenly, white's bishop, having cleared the king's path, forces the black monarch to retreat further into the open, tightening the noose around its vulnerable position. The black king, after its long journey, finds itself once again pushed towards the edge of the board, a familiar but precarious position, and the immediate challenge is to solidify its safety before white's rook and bishop can launch a decisive assault. The bishop's repositioning to e5 aims to dominate the c7 square and potentially support a knight's advance towards the black king's weakened defenses. Relocating the king to the corner, a move that often signals a last stand or preparation for an eventual pawn push, now seeks to shelter from white's advancing pieces on the king side. Exploiting the weakened king position, this check forces black's monarch further into a perilous zone, tightening white's control over the crucial diagonals and preparing to mop up remaining pieces. King's safety has evaporated. The monarch is now a vulnerable target under a relentless barrage. Pushing the g-pawn creates a new escape square for the king. A subtle but important detail given the current proximity of the enemy bishop. Escaping the mating net, black's king seeks refuge on the edge of the board, a necessary maneuver to avoid the relentless knight and bishop pressure. The rook's migration to the 8th rank is a strategic repositioning, aiming to exploit the open file and potentially create mating threats against the black king, which remains exposed in the center. The bishop retreats to a more passive square, surrendering the active diagonal it occupied, while the rook on the 7th rank remains a potent force, potentially aiming for the a file or creating checks. Seizing the open file with the rook forces the black king into a cornered position, limiting its escape routes and setting the stage for a swift mating attack. The black king now shuffles awkwardly, seeking refuge behind its own ranks as the white rook prowls for any exposed weakness. The bishop repositions to eye the pawn and potentially support a future kingside advance, subtly pressuring black's king's protection. Aha! The rook makes its decisive charge towards the open file, aiming to stir up trouble and exploit that vulnerable, uncastled king. Unleashing a pivotal bishop maneuver, this forces the black king into a cornered predicament, demanding an immediate response to avoid tactical unraveling. The rook's capture of the pawn significantly alters the material balance, forcing a complex endgame where black aims to leverage its two-pawn advantage against white's potentially exposed king, unleashing a potent discovered attack. This check forces the black king into a desperate scramble and opens a path for white's rooks to dominate the remaining open files. The black king, having ventured out of its protective castling shell, now faces a complex web of potential threats and, surprisingly, a path to relative safety, as this maneuver seeks to consolidate its position behind a newly formed pawn wall. Seizing the open file with the rook offers a decisive attacking platform, forcing black's king into a vulnerable defensive position and threatening to create unstoppable passed pawns. The rook makes a daring infiltration onto the third rank, seeking out juicy pawn targets like the a4 pawn and attempting to disrupt white's structural integrity and create immediate threats against the exposed king. Asserting dominance on the queenside now, this bishop's redeployment shuns passive defense and aims to smother black's potential counterplay by controlling key squares that could enable breakthroughs. The rook is no longer supported by the pawn and is vulnerable to discovery attacks on the open files. This piece, suddenly finding itself on the 7th rank, aggressively eyes the vulnerable king and aims to exploit its precarious position. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare a counterplay against the rook on b6. Accelerating the pawn's advance to the 6th rank forces black's pieces into a more cramped and vulnerable configuration, a desperate attempt to gain space before the material imbalance becomes insurmountable. The rook retreats, eyeing potential activity on the queenside, but white's control over the a-file seems unshakable and poised to become a decisive advantage. Unveiling a dazzling check, the bishop strategically pierces the king's defenses from a new angle, aiming to disrupt black's rook and potentially force further concessions. Sensing a glimmer of hope in the weakened pawn structure, black's king ventures out, seeking potential counterplay amidst the otherwise suffocating pressure. The king's desperate dash for safety is momentarily halted as the a-pawn lunges forward, transforming into a queen and ending the chase. Rescuing the pawn from its perilous outpost on a7 now becomes the paramount concern, as its capture would further consolidate white's material advantage and the rooks would find an even easier path to victory. Activating the king is paramount in this endgame, bringing it closer to the action to support the rook and prepare for any pawn advances or defensive needs. The black rook now retreats to safety on the queenside, entangling itself from the immediate threats and preparing to potentially support a pawn advance or offer defense. Reclaiming the passed pawn with the rook shifts the focus to consolidating the queenside advantage, forcing black to make a difficult decision about how to defend their king's pawn structure. The rook now seeks refuge on d4, aiming to shield the king from further exposure and prepare for potential counterplay along the d-file, a crucial artery in this endgame where material is scarce. A decisive check that initiates a mating net, forcing the black king into a desperate position. A desperate attempt to create complications. This checking maneuver sacrifices the bishop for temporary activity, hoping to deflect the white king's advance and perhaps find an escape for the black monarch amidst the ensuing chaos. The king shuffles forward, a crucial step to potentially reinforce the pawn chain and offer a refuge for the beleaguered bishop, aiming to consolidate before black's pieces can exploit the open lines and swarm the weakened king. King activity is paramount as we transition into this likely drawn endgame, and swinging the rook over to the a-file opens up critical lines for further skirmishes. A crucial repositioning of the monarch, seeking the relative safety of the queenside flank and preparing to support any eventual pawn push. Even though the immediate threats are primarily focused on the kingside, bringing the king into the thick of the action on the queenside. This maneuver aims to support the passed pawn's advance. A desperate gamble to create counterplay against white's overwhelming material advantage. The white rook, unburdened by the recent exchange, now eyes the 7th rank, a potent launching pad for pressure against black's still exposed monarch. The bishop tucks itself away, a defensive retreat to a square that might offer protection for the king. But it also abandons the active central influence it previously held, potentially surrendering initiative and allowing white's rook to become an even more menacing presence along the 7th rank. Reclaiming the open file with the rook is paramount, forcing the opponent's hand and preventing them from consolidating their newly acquired central space. The black king boldly ventures into enemy territory, seeking to disrupt white's rook's influence on the newly opened 7th rank. Seizing the initiative, white boldly pushes the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and create potential mating threats on the kingside. Black's king finally escapes the clutches of white's pursuing pieces, seeking refuge on a safer square amidst the chaos of the endgame. Unleashing a final tactical flourish, the rook's discovery aims to dislodge the black king from its precarious sanctuary, potentially forcing a swift resolution by either material gain or a mating attack. The monarch steps into a potential minefield, aiming to flee the immediate checks but opening new lines of attack for the vigilant white rook. Unleashing the pawn to liberate the rook on a8. This audacious pawn advance creates a critical fork, potentially crippling black's defense by separating the king and the bishop. The bishop bravely steps forward, offering itself as a sacrifice to disrupt white's advancing pawn structure and open a potential escape for its monarch. Unleashing the rook to dominate the 7th rank, aiming to escort the king to safety or exploit the exposed black monarch. The black king, exposed on the 3rd rank, now faces a desperate bid for safety by retreating to the relative security of the queenside, hoping to escape the immediate threat of white's rook and bishop. Initiating a daring king walk, Cade1** fearlessly ventures towards the center, seeking to activate its dormant power and potentially join the fray on the queenside where black's pieces are currently concentrated. Unleashing the bishop to a more active diagonal, forcing white to confront the threat to the pawn chain and potentially opening up further infiltration possibilities down the c-file. King's safety is paramount in this razor-thin endgame, and activating the monarch toward the center is a critical step toward consolidating the advantage and preparing for the final push. Seizing the open b-file offers a fresh avenue for counterplay, potentially disrupting white's rook and king coordination while opening up lines for the black king to potentially seek refuge or even participate more actively if the pawn advances further. Exploiting the weak d-pawn in the open a-file will be paramount now, as the king is forced to dance across the board. Sacrificing the pawn to create a passed b-pawn opens up exciting endgame possibilities, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially force a queen promotion. Initiating a delicate pawn push to liberate the rook, aiming to disrupt the queen's influence on the queenside and perhaps prepare a more active role for the king in the endgame. Sacrificing the pawn on a7 offers a desperate attempt to activate the rook along the open 7th rank, potentially disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain and creating counterplay before the inevitable king hunt concludes. Unlocking the endgame by forcing a queen trade. This establishes a clear path towards simplifying into a winning pawn race. leveraging the superior pawn structure in the active bishop. Seizing the open file is paramount. Yet the rook's relocation here seems to invite further penetration by white's monarch. Opening up the b-file for the rook. This piece repositioning aims to create immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns and potentially disrupt their defensive structure. The rook now finds itself on the second rank, a powerful outpost that can exert immense pressure on white's queenside pawns and potentially target the vulnerable b3 square if white isn't careful. Repositioning the bishop to e5 aims to control the critical squares d6 and f6, further restricting black's king and preparing for potential breakthroughs. A desperate, last-ditch effort to disrupt the advancing king and create a mating net with the knight sacrifice, hoping to exploit the exposed white monarch.